The first time Hugh Rourke heard Julia Turner's name, it came wrapped in a warning and a laugh, delivered by a toothless old man at the livery in Abilene who told him he'd seen grown ranch hands quit on the spot rather than take another tongue-lashing from her. That was the spring of 1878, and Hugh Rourke had ridden into Kansas with little more than a good horse, a Winchester rifle, and a past he did not care to speak of. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of hard work, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in late autumn. He had spent 6 years as a Texas Ranger before he grew tired of violence and the endless chasing of men who did not want to be caught, and he had drifted north looking for something quieter. A ranch job, he had thought. Steady work, honest pay, and no bullets flying past his ear. "You looking for work, you say?" The old liveryman squinted at him while he unsaddled a bay gelding. "Turner Spread is hiring. Big outfit, west of town, good grazing land along the Smoky Hill River. But I will tell you now, mister, so you cannot say nobody warned you. Julia Turner runs that place, and she has got a temper on her that would strip bark off a cottonwood tree. 3 foremen in 2 years, all good men. All ran off with their tails between their legs." Hugh had smiled at that, the kind of easy smile that made men trust him and women wonder about him. "I reckon I have dealt with worse than an angry woman." "You have not met this one," the liveryman said, shaking his head like a man remembering a bad dream. "Her daddy died 2 years back, left her that ranch and near 4,000 head of cattle, and every man in this county figured she would sell out inside a year and go marry some banker. She did not sell, she did not marry nobody. She just got harder, meaner. Folks say she caught a man cheating her on a cattle count, and she near put a bullwhip mark across his back before the sheriff pulled her off him." "Sounds like the man deserved it," Hugh said. The liveryman laughed, a wheezing sound. "Maybe so, but you go on out there anyhow. I reckon you will not last a week." Hugh Rourke rode west that same afternoon, the sun sliding low and golden over the endless grass, and he told himself that a woman's temper was nothing next to the things he had already survived. He did not know, riding out along that dusty trail with his hat pulled low against the wind, that he was riding toward the only thing in this world that would ever truly humble him. The Turner Ranch sat in a wide bowl of land along the river, a sprawling clapboard house with a wraparound porch, a bunkhouse and corrals that stretched out toward the horizon. Cattle dotted the hills in every direction, red and brown against the green, and Hugh felt something in his chest ease at the sight of it. It was a good place, a place a man could build something. He found Julia Turner in the corral, and his first sight of her was not what he expected. She was not some hard-faced spinster with a permanent scowl. She was young, no more than 26, with dark hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a figure that filled out her riding skirt in a way that made a man's mouth go dry. She was working a young Mustang on a lead line, her voice low and steady even as the horse fought her, and there was a grace to the way she moved that spoke of years spent in the saddle rather than years spent in a parlor. Then the horse reared and nearly caught her with a hoof, and she let loose a string of words that would have made a mule skinner blush, and Hugh understood immediately why men left. "You there," she called out, spotting him at the fence rail. "If you are here to gawk, you can turn that horse around and ride back the way you came. I have got no patience for it today." "I am here about the foreman job," Hugh said, tipping his hat. "Name is Hugh Rourke." She looked him over the way a buyer might look over a horse at auction, taking in his height, his build, the way he sat easy in the saddle. "You look like you might last longer than the others. That is not saying much." She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. "You know how to handle cattle." "I have handled cattle, horses, and men who did not want handling. 6 years with the Texas Rangers before I decided I preferred a quieter kind of trouble." Something flickered in her green eyes at that, an interest she tried to hide. "A ranger, that is something, I suppose, though I have found lawmen make poor ranch hands, too used to giving orders instead of following them." "I can follow orders just fine, ma'am, so long as they make sense." Her chin lifted at that, a challenge in her stance. And what happens when they do not make sense to you? Then I reckon we will have a conversation about it, Hugh said, and he let his smile show just a little, enough to let her know he was not afraid of her, though every instinct in him said he probably should be. Julia Turner studied him a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes that he could not quite name. Bunkhouse is that way. Wages are $30 a month and found. You start at dawn, and if you cannot keep up, I will not slow down to wait for you. Are we understood, Mr. Rourke? Understood, Miss Turner. She turned back to the Mustang without another word, and Hugh rode toward the bunkhouse with the strange feeling that he had just walked into something far more complicated than a simple ranching job. That first week, Hugh Rourke learned quickly that everything the liveryman had told him was true, and yet somehow it was not the whole truth either. Julia Turner worked harder than any man on that ranch. She was up before dawn and in the saddle until well after dark, checking fence lines, doctoring sick cattle, riding out to inspect grazing land that stretched for miles in every direction. She knew every hand's name, every horse's temperament, every quirk of the land her father had carved out of the prairie. She did not ask her men to do anything she would not do herself, and there was a fairness in her that Hugh respected even when her tongue turned sharp. But her temper was a living thing, quick to rise and slow to fade. She had no patience for laziness, for excuses, for men who thought a woman running a ranch was an invitation to cut corners or take liberties. Hugh watched her dress down a hand twice her age for letting a gate stand open, watched her fire a man on the spot for drinking on the job, watched her face turn to stone when a neighboring rancher rode over to make what he called a friendly offer to buy her land. "Mr. Caldwell," she had said, standing on her own porch with her arms crossed, "I have told you 3 times now that this ranch is not for sale. If you ride out here a 4th time to ask, I will start charging you for the privilege of wasting my time." The man, a heavy-set rancher named Otis Caldwell who owned the spread bordering hers to the south, had laughed in a way that made Hugh's hands curl into fists where he stood by the corral pretending to check a bridle. "Now, Miss Turner, a woman alone cannot keep a place like this running forever. Sooner or later the bank will come calling, or the rustlers will bleed you dry, and you will wish you had taken my offer when it was still generous." "I will take my chances," Julia had said, her voice like ice. "Good day, Mr. Caldwell." Hugh had watched Caldwell ride away with a scowl on his face, and he had turned to find Julia watching him watch her. "You have got something to say, Mr. Rourke." "Only that Caldwell strikes me as a man who does not take no for an answer easy." "He will learn," Julia said, and there was steel in her voice that Hugh found himself admiring more than he probably should. It was in the small moments that Hugh began to see past the temper into the woman underneath. He saw her sit up 3 nights running with a sick calf, coaxing it to drink from a bottle with a patience she rarely showed the hired men. He saw her slip extra wages to a young hand named Danny Whitfield, whose mother was ailing back in Missouri, and swear him to secrecy about it with a look that could have curdled milk. He saw her, late one evening, sitting alone on the porch steps with a photograph in her hands, her shoulders bowed in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. He did not mean to intrude, but the boards creaked beneath his boot, and she looked up sharply, quickly tucking the photograph into her apron pocket. "I did not mean to disturb you," Hugh said. "You did not disturb me." But her voice was softer than usual, and she did not order him away, which he took as an invitation of sorts. He sat on the step below hers, not too close, and looked out at the darkening prairie where the first stars were beginning to prick through the purple sky. "That your father?" he asked after a while. "The photograph." Julia was quiet so long he thought she would not answer. Then, "My father built this ranch from nothing. Came out here in '58 with a wagon and a dream and about $40 to his name. My mother died when I was 6, and it was just the 2 of us after that. He taught me to ride before I could properly walk, taught me to read a brand and count a herd and shoot a rifle straight." He used to say I had his stubbornness and my mother's temper, and God help any man who tried to tell me different. Sounds like he was proud of you. He was. Her voice caught just slightly. He died 2 years ago. His horse threw him out on the East Range, and by the time we found him, it was too late. Everyone in this county figured I would sell up within the year. Figured a woman could not run a spread this size on her own. She looked out at the dark hills, her jaw tight. I have spent 2 years proving them wrong, Mr. Rourke, and I do not intend to stop now, no matter how many Otis Caldwells come sniffing around trying to steal what my father built with his own 2 hands. Hugh looked at her profile in the fading light, the determined set of her jaw, the fierce pride that radiated off her like heat off summer stone, and he felt something shift inside his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. For what it is worth, he said quietly, I do not think you need anyone's permission to keep what is yours. Julia turned to look at him then, really look at him, and for a moment the sharp edges of her seemed to soften. That is a kind thing to say, Mr. Rourke. Call me Hugh, he said. Seems only fair, since you have already fired me twice in your head this week. That got a laugh out of her, a real one, surprised and warm, and it was the most beautiful sound Hugh Rourke had heard in years. Only twice. I must be losing my touch. I reckon you are just saving the good tempers for special occasions, Hugh said, and she laughed again, and something between them settled into place that neither of them could yet name. The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of peace to the Turner ranch, though peace was perhaps too gentle a word for the sparring that continued daily between Hugh Rourke and Julia Turner. She still lost her temper. She still barked orders and cursed like a mule skinner when a fence needed mending in the rain, still stared down hands twice her size without a flicker of fear. But more and more, Hugh found himself the target of her sharp tongue, not out of anger, but out of something else entirely, a kind of teasing challenge that danced dangerously close to flirtation. You are doing that wrong, she told him one afternoon as he worked to shoe a stubborn gelding, and when he looked up with an eyebrow raised, she flushed and looked away. The angle of the nail, you will split the hoof. Is that so? Hugh set down the hammer and crossed his arms, letting his gaze linger on her a moment too long. Funny, my old foreman down in Texas taught me this same method, and he shod horses for 20 years without a single complaint. Well, your old foreman was clearly wrong. Or maybe, Hugh said, stepping closer, you just like finding reasons to stand around and watch me work. Julia's cheeks went pink, and for once her sharp tongue failed her entirely. She turned on her heel and stalked off toward the house, and Hugh laughed to himself as he went back to shoeing the horse, feeling more alive than he had in years. It was Danny Whitfield, the young hand whose mother Julia secretly helped support, who finally said out loud what half the ranch had already noticed. She likes you, Danny said one evening as they sat around the bunkhouse table playing cards. Miss Turner, she does not yell at you half as much as she used to yell at the others. She yells at me plenty, Hugh said, though he could not quite keep the smile off his face. Not the same kind of yelling, Danny said with the wisdom of a boy who had grown up watching people fall in love and fall apart in equal measure. The others, she yelled because she wanted them gone. You, she yells because she does not know what else to do with the way she is feeling. Hugh did not have an answer for that, because some part of him suspected the boy was right, and some part of him was terrified of what that might mean. It was a hot afternoon in June when everything began to shift between them, when a sudden thunderstorm rolled in off the plains faster than anyone expected, and Julia and Hugh found themselves caught out on the East Range checking fence lines, with no shelter in sight but a lone cottonwood tree and a shallow overhang of rock along the creek bed. They rode hard for the rock, rain lashing sideways, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white streaks, and by the time they got their horses tucked beneath the overhang and threw themselves down into the meager shelter, they were both soaked to the skin and laughing despite themselves. Some ranch hand you are, Julia said, wringing water from her braid, riding straight into a storm instead of reading the sky. I was reading the sky just fine. I was reading you instead, wondering if you would admit you were tired before the storm hit. I am never tired. Everyone gets tired, Julia. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the word hung between them in the rain-cooled air, intimate in a way that made her breath catch. "You should not call me that," she said, though there was no real heat in it. "Why not? You call me Hugh readily enough now. That is different." "How is it different?" She did not answer right away, and in the quiet between them, with the rain drumming against the rock overhead and their shoulders nearly touching in the cramped shelter, Hugh Rourke found himself looking at her mouth in a way he had been trying very hard not to do for weeks. "Hugh," she said softly, and it was the first time she had said his name like that, like it meant something. "I have buried my father, run off 3 foremen, faced down a man who wants to steal my land out from under me, and I have never once let myself need anybody. I do not know how to do this." "Do what?" "This." She gestured vaguely between them, her voice cracking just slightly. "Whatever this is." Hugh reached out slowly and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her jaw. "Maybe you do not have to know how. Maybe you just let it happen. I am not a woman men fall in love with, Hugh Rourke. I am a woman men run from." "Then I reckon those men were fools," Hugh said, "because I have never wanted to run less in my whole life." The rain continued to fall around them, and for a long moment neither of them moved, caught in the charged silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something neither quite dared to name. Then Julia leaned in just slightly, and Hugh closed the distance, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of rain and lightning, and 2 years of loneliness finally breaking apart like storm clouds. When they finally pulled back, breathless, Julia's eyes were wide with something between fear and wonder. "That should not have happened," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because you work for me. Because I do not know a single thing about you beyond the fact that you were a ranger and you are stubborn as an old mule. Because every man who has ever gotten close to me has either run off or tried to take something from me, and I do not know which one you are yet." Hugh took her hand, calloused and strong from years of ranch work, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that made her breath hitch. "I am not running, Julia Turner. And I do not want a single thing from you that you are not willing to give freely. Not your ranch, not your cattle, not your money, just you, if you will have me." The storm broke around them, and somewhere in the wild green hills a thunderhead rolled east toward Abilene, and Julia Turner, who had sworn off needing anyone the day she buried her father, found herself falling in love with a drifter who had ridden onto her land with nothing but a good horse and an easy smile, and had somehow become the one thing she could not run from. They rode back to the ranch house that evening, soaked and quiet, something new and fragile sitting between them, and though neither spoke of the kiss again that night, both of them carried it like a secret ember, warm against the cold uncertainty of what came next. The trouble began 3 weeks later, on a hot afternoon when Julia rode out to check the herds on the East Range and found nearly 200 head of cattle missing from the count. She sat her horse at the top of a rise, counting and recounting, her stomach sinking with each pass. 200 head did not simply wander off. 200 head meant rustlers, and rustlers on this scale meant someone organized, someone with wagons and men and a place to move stolen cattle before the brands could be questioned. She rode back to the ranch house at a hard gallop, and Hugh met her in the yard before she had even swung down from her horse. "What is it?" he asked, seeing the look on her face. 200 head gone from the East Range. Maybe more. I did not have time to check the north pasture. Hugh's jaw tightened. "Rustlers. Has to be. That is no ordinary stray count." She dismounted, pacing in tight, furious circles. "I know who is behind this, Hugh. I would bet my whole ranch on it. Caldwell. Caldwell." She spat the name like poison. "He has wanted this land for 2 years, and when I would not sell, he decided to bleed me dry instead. Steal enough cattle, and I will not be able to make the note at the bank come autumn, and then he will swoop in and buy the whole place out from under me for pennies." "You cannot prove that," Hugh said carefully. "I do not need to prove it to know it is true." "No," Hugh agreed, but you will need to prove it to the sheriff if you want him to do a damn thing about it. And you cannot go riding onto Caldwell's land making accusations without proof, Julia. That is exactly the kind of thing that gets a woman labeled hot-headed and dismissed before she even opens her mouth. Julia rounded on him, her eyes flashing. So what would you have me do, Hugh Rourke? Sit here quietly and let him steal my father's ranch out from under me, while I wait politely for proof to fall into my lap. I would have you let me help you find that proof, Hugh said, holding his ground against her fury the way he always had, calm and steady even as she raged. I spent 6 years hunting men who thought they were smarter than the law. I know how rustlers move cattle, how they alter brands where they sell the herds. Let me ride out, quiet-like, and see what I can find before you go charging in and giving Caldwell the satisfaction of watching you lose your temper in front of witnesses. Julia's chest heaved with the effort of holding back everything she wanted to say, and for a long moment she simply stared at him, torn between the fury that had carried her through 2 years of loneliness and the strange, unfamiliar comfort of having someone stand beside her instead of against her. "Fine," she said finally, "but I am coming with you. Julia, it is my ranch, Hugh. My cattle, my father's legacy. I'm not staying behind while you ride off to fix my problems for me." Hugh studied her a long moment, and something like respect flickered behind his eyes. "All right, but we do this smart. No riding in with guns blazing. We find the proof first." They rode out together at dawn 2 days later, following a trail of churned earth and scattered cattle tracks that led north along the river before curving west, away from Julia's land, and toward the rougher country near the Kansas Pacific rail line. It was Hugh's ranger training that read the signs properly, the way the tracks bunched near a dry creek bed where a wagon had clearly waited, the way certain hoofprints showed the distinctive shoe pattern of a farrier who worked out of the town nearest to Caldwell's spread. They found the hidden holding pen 2 days later, tucked into a wooded ravine 8 miles north of Caldwell's ranch house, nearly 150 head of cattle penned behind makeshift fencing, most of them bearing Julia's Circle T brand crudely reworked into something that could pass, at a careless glance, for Caldwell's own bar. C. Julia's hands trembled with fury as she surveyed the herd from the ridge above, counting brands through Hugh's field glasses. "That son of a easy," Hugh said, his hand on her arm. "We have got proof now. That is what matters. We ride to the sheriff, we bring him out here, and we let the law handle this properly." "The law," Julia said bitterly, "did precious little for me when Caldwell first started sniffing around my land 2 years ago. The law will do something now, because now we have got cattle with reworked brands sitting on land that Caldwell cannot explain away as an accident." They rode for the town of Ellsworth, the nearest place with a proper sheriff's office, and Hugh watched Julia hold her temper in check the entire ride, watched her force herself to breathe slow and steady, even as every part of her wanted to ride straight to Caldwell's porch and demand satisfaction with her own 2 hands. It was, he thought, one of the bravest things he had ever watched a person do, harder in its way than any gunfight he had ever ridden into as a ranger. Sheriff Wade Collins was a weathered man in his 50s who had known Julia's father for 20 years, and he listened to their account with a grim, careful patience before agreeing to ride out with a small posse to investigate the holding pen for himself. What they found when they arrived was worse than cattle rustling alone. Otis Caldwell was there himself, along with 3 hired men, in the process of loading a portion of the stolen herd onto cattle cars at a small rail siding that served his property, clearly intending to ship the reworked cattle east before anyone came looking. When the sheriff's posse rode up with Julia and Hugh alongside them, Caldwell's face went the color of old ash. "Sheriff Collins," Caldwell said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes, "what brings you out this way?" "These cattle, Otis," the sheriff said, nodding toward the pen, "bearing brands that look an awful lot like they started out as Circle T before somebody took a hot iron to them." "I do not know what you are talking about. Those are my cattle bought fair from a trader out of Dodge City just last month." "That is a lie," Julia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Those are my cattle, Otis Caldwell, and you know it. I counted them myself not 3 weeks past before 200 head went missing from my East Range. You have got no proof of that, Caldwell snarled, some of his composure cracking. I have got 150 head of proof standing right in front of me, Julia shot back, and a sheriff standing beside me who is going to inspect every single one of those reworked brands until he finds the truth hiding underneath. Caldwell's hired men shifted uneasily, glancing between their employer and the armed posse, and Hugh could see the moment the whole scheme began to unravel, the moment Caldwell realized that no amount of bluster would save him from the evidence standing in the pen before them. "This is not over, Turner," Caldwell hissed, as the sheriff's men began separating out the cattle and preparing to place him under arrest. "You think you have won something here, but a woman cannot hold onto land like yours forever. Sooner or later you will lose it, with or without my help." Julia stepped forward, close enough that Caldwell flinched back slightly, and there was nothing but cold fury in her voice when she spoke. "I have buried my father, run this ranch alone for 2 years, and just caught you red-handed stealing my herd. I think I have proven exactly how long I can hold onto what is mine, Otis Caldwell. You are the one heading off to answer for cattle theft. I would say I have won plenty." The sheriff hauled Caldwell and his men off toward Ellsworth to face charges, and as the dust settled and the recovered cattle were slowly driven back toward Julia's land, she finally allowed herself to sag against Hugh's side, the fury draining out of her all at once, leaving something raw and exhausted in its place. "You did that," Hugh said softly, his arm coming around her shoulders. "You did that, Julia, not your temper, your patience, your smarts. You held it together when it counted." "I wanted to shoot him," Julia admitted, half laughing, half crying with the release of 2 years of tension finally breaking free. "I wanted to shoot him the moment I saw those brands. I know you did. And I am prouder of you for not doing it than I would have been if you had." She looked up at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and something passed between them that went far deeper than the victory of recovered cattle or a rustler brought to justice. It was the understanding, finally spoken without words, that they had become partners in every sense that mattered, that whatever fire burned inside Julia Turner had found, in Hugh Rourke, not a man who wanted to smother it, but one who wanted to stand beside it and let it burn bright. They rode home together beneath a sky streaked orange and purple with the setting sun, the recovered herd lowing softly behind them, and neither of them spoke of what had passed between them in the ravine, but both of them knew that something had changed for good. The weeks following Caldwell's arrest brought a strange kind of quiet to the Turner Ranch, the quiet that comes after a long storm has finally passed. Caldwell's ranch, stripped of its owner and facing a mountain of legal trouble, was put up for auction by the bank that held its notes, and though several buyers came sniffing around, none of them proved willing to take on land tainted by scandal and thievery. Julia found herself, for the first time in 2 years, without an enemy at her door, without a threat hanging over her herds or her land, and in the space that fear had once occupied, something else began to grow. She and Hugh fell into an easy rhythm together, working the ranch side by side, and though her temper still flared on occasion, quick and hot as summer lightning, it no longer carried the same edge of desperation it once had. She laughed more. She lingered on the porch in the evenings, instead of retreating immediately to her ledgers. She caught herself, more than once, watching Hugh work across the yard with a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a feeling she had spent 2 years refusing to name. It was Danny Whitfield who finally forced the issue, in his own quiet, 16-year-old way, by leaving a wildflower bouquet on Julia's porch step with a note that read simply, in careful, uneven handwriting, from a man too stubborn to say it himself. Julia found it on a Tuesday morning and marched straight to the corral where Hugh was working a new colt, flowers in hand, cheeks flushed with something between fury and delight. "Did you put Danny up to this?" she demanded, holding up the bouquet. Hugh looked at the flowers, then at her flushed face, and could not quite keep himself from grinning. I might have mentioned to him that I did not know the proper way to court a woman who runs a cattle empire and holds a bullwhip like other women hold a fan. You are ridiculous. I am persistent, Hugh corrected, stepping closer, which I understand is a quality you value, given how hard you have fought to hold onto everything that matters to you. Julia's anger, such as it was, melted away as quickly as it had risen. Hugh Rourke, are you courting me? I have been courting you for months, Julia Turner. I was simply waiting for you to notice. I noticed the day you kissed me in a thunderstorm. Then I reckon it is past time I did this properly. He took the flowers from her hands, set them aside on the fence post, and took both her hands in his thumbs brushing gently over her calloused knuckles. Julia Turner, I have loved you since the day I watched you stare down Otis Caldwell on your own porch steps without so much as a tremor in your voice. I loved you more the day I watched you hold your temper in check for the sake of getting justice done right. And I love you now, standing in this corral with flower petals falling out of your hair, more than I have loved anything or anyone in my whole life. I do not have much to offer you beyond myself. No ranch, no fortune, nothing but a good horse and an honest heart. But if you will have me, I would be the proudest man in Kansas to call myself your husband. Julia's eyes filled with tears, and for once in her life, words seemed to fail her entirely. She simply stepped forward and pressed her lips to his, pouring 2 years of loneliness and hope and hard-won love into that single kiss. And when they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, she pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Yes, Hugh Rourke. God help you, yes." They were married in September, beneath the same cottonwood tree where they had once sheltered from a thunderstorm, and shared their first kiss, with the entire ranch crew in attendance and half the town of Abilene besides, curious to see the notoriously hot-tempered Julia Turner finally settle down with the drifter everyone had warned would not last a week. Reverend Samuel Whitcomb presided over the ceremony, his voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd as the September sun slanted golden through the cottonwood leaves. Julia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and pressed by the women of the town who had, over the years, come to respect her fierce independence even as they gossiped about her temper. Hugh stood waiting at the makeshift altar in his best coat, and when Julia appeared at the top of the porch steps, escorted by old Sheriff Collins in place of the father she had lost, Hugh felt his breath catch entirely. "You look beautiful," he whispered when she finally reached him. "You look terrified," she whispered back, a smile playing at her lips. "I am terrified. I am about to marry the most stubborn, hot-tempered, magnificent woman in the entire state of Kansas, and I would not trade it for anything in this world." Julia laughed through her tears, and the Reverend cleared his throat gently, and they turned to face him together, hand in hand, ready to begin the rest of their lives. The vows they exchanged were simple and heartfelt, promises of partnership and loyalty that meant far more coming from two people who had already proven themselves to each other through fire and fury and hard-won trust. When Reverend Whitcomb finally pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled crowd erupted into cheers, and Danny Whitfield, grinning ear to ear, fired his rifle twice into the air in celebration, startling half the horses tied along the fence and sending the crowd into fresh laughter. That night, after the celebration had wound down and the last of the well-wishers had ridden off toward town, Hugh and Julia stood together on the porch of the ranch house that was now, in every sense, both of theirs. "I used to think," Julia said softly, leaning into Hugh's side as they watched the stars emerge over the darkened prairie, "that no man would ever want to stay. That my temper would drive off anyone who came close, the same way it drove off every foreman before you. Your temper is not something to be ashamed of, Julia. It is the same fire that kept this ranch alive after your father died. The same fire that stood up to Caldwell when every other rancher in this county would have folded. I did not fall in love with you despite your temper. I fell in love with you because of it and everything underneath it, the loyalty and the courage and the fierce, stubborn love you pour into everything and everyone you care about." "Nobody warned you about that part," Julia murmured against his shoulder. "No," Hugh agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Nobody warned me you would be worth every single bit of it. I had to find that out for myself." They stood together beneath the wide Kansas sky, husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word, and Julia Turner, who had once sworn she needed no one, found herself utterly, joyfully grateful for the drifter who had ridden onto her land and refused to run. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for ranching in Kansas in the years following the war was never an easy life, filled with the constant threats of drought, hard winters, and the ever-present danger of cattle disease sweeping through a herd overnight. But Hugh and Julia faced each trial together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing season, until the name Rourke Turner Ranch became known throughout the county not for scandal or temper, but for the quality of its cattle and the fairness of its dealings. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after the reverend who had married them, was born in the spring of 1879, arriving during a fierce thunderstorm that had Hugh pacing the porch in a panic while the midwife worked inside. And Julia, even in the throes of labor, found the strength to shout through the closed door that if Hugh Rourke did not stop wearing a groove into her porch boards, she would come out there and give him something real to worry about. Samuel grew up sturdy and strong-willed, with his mother's fierce green eyes and his father's easy patience, and by the time he was old enough to sit a horse, he was already trailing after Hugh through the pastures, asking endless questions about brands and breeding and the proper way to read a coming storm. 2 years after Samuel's birth, Julia gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Grace, in honor of Julia's mother, whose photograph still sat in a place of honor on the mantel alongside her father's. Grace inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's calm steadiness, a balance of fire and patience that made her, from an early age, the peacekeeper between her more spirited older brother and the 2 younger siblings who would follow in the years after. By 1885, the Rourke Turner Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 6,000 head of cattle and stood as one of the most respected outfits in that stretch of Kansas. Its success built not on the ruthless expansion that men like Otis Caldwell had once tried to force, but on honest dealing, fair wages, and a reputation for standing by one's word that both Hugh and Julia had worked tirelessly to build. Otis Caldwell himself had served 2 years in the state penitentiary for cattle theft before disappearing from the county entirely, and his land, sold off piece by piece to satisfy his debts, had eventually been purchased in small parcels by some of the very hands who had once worked under him, men who built modest, honest spreads of their own on the ashes of his greed. Julia took a quiet, private satisfaction in watching justice unfold that way, slow and steady, the same way she had learned to temper her own fire into something that built rather than destroyed. Danny Whitfield, the young hand whose kindness had first pushed Hugh and Julia toward admitting their feelings, stayed on with the ranch for many years, eventually marrying a schoolteacher from Ellsworth and settling on a small parcel of land that Hugh and Julia gifted him as a wedding present, in gratitude for his years of loyal service and his role, however small, in bringing the 2 of them together. Julia's temper, though it never fully disappeared, mellowed into something the whole county came to respect rather than fear. She remained fierce in defense of what she loved, quick to speak her mind, unyielding when she believed herself in the right, but the desperation that had once fueled her anger had long since been replaced by the deep security of a life built on love and partnership. She still occasionally lost patience with a stubborn horse or a careless hand, still raised her voice when the situation called for it, but Hugh had long since learned that her fire, properly understood, was simply another form of the same fierce loyalty that had first drawn him to her. "You know," Julia said one evening in the autumn of 1888, as they sat together on the same porch where they had first exchanged their wedding vows, watching their 4 children play in the yard beneath a sky painted brilliant orange by the setting sun. "That old liveryman in Abilene told you I would run you off within a week." "He did," Hugh agreed, his arm around her shoulders as it had been on so many evenings over the past 10 years. "And instead you stayed 10 years, married me, gave me 4 children, and built the finest ranch in this county alongside me." "I did. Are you sorry, Hugh Rourke, for not listening to that old man's warning?" Hugh turned to look at her, at the fine lines that had begun to gather at the corners of her eyes, the silver threading through her dark hair, the same fierce fire still burning bright behind her green eyes even after all these years, and he felt his heart swell with the same overwhelming love that had first struck him on that rain-soaked afternoon beneath the rock overhang so many years before. "Julia Turner," he said softly, using her maiden name the way he sometimes did in moments of tenderness, a private joke between them that never failed to make her smile. "That old man warned me you had a temper. He never once warned me you would be the finest thing that ever happened to me. I would ride into this county 1,000 times over, knowing everything I know now, just for the chance to love you again." Julia's eyes filled with tears, the same way they had on their wedding day, and she leaned in to kiss her husband beneath the darkening Kansas sky, their children's laughter ringing out across the yard, the cattle lowing softly in the distance, the ranch that her father had built and that she and Hugh had grown together stretching out in every direction as far as the eye could see, a testament to fierce love, hard-won trust, and the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the very fire that drives others away is the same fire that draws home the one person strong enough and stubborn enough to stay. That winter brought an unusually hard freeze to the plains, the kind that tested even the most experienced ranchers, and Hugh and Julia worked side by side through the bitter cold, breaking ice on the water troughs, moving cattle to sheltered draws, staying up through long nights to make sure no calves were lost to the brutal temperatures. It was grueling work, the kind that had broken lesser partnerships in years past, but Hugh found that hardship only seemed to deepen the bond between them, each trial reminding them both of everything they had already overcome together. Their eldest son, Samuel, now 9 years old, insisted on riding out with his father during the worst of the freeze, determined to prove himself capable despite his mother's initial objections. "He is too young, Hugh," Julia had argued, standing in the yard bundled against the cold, watching her son saddle his pony with a determination that reminded her painfully of herself at that age. "He is your son, Julia," Hugh had said gently, "which means arguing him out of something he has set his mind to is about as likely as arguing a Kansas blizzard into changing course." Julia had huffed at that, but she had also seen the truth in it, and she had relented, watching with her heart in her throat as Hugh and Samuel rode out together into the bitter cold, returning hours later with 3 calves that would have otherwise frozen, Samuel practically glowing with pride at having helped save them. "He takes after you," Hugh said that night, as they lay together in the warm darkness of their bedroom, the children finally asleep down the hall. "He takes after both of us," Julia corrected. "That is rather the point of children, is it not? They become some strange, wonderful combination of everything their parents are." "I suppose that is true." Hugh was quiet a moment, then added softly, "I am grateful every single day, Julia, that fate saw fit to send me down that particular trail in the spring of '78. I could have ridden any direction. I could have taken work at any ranch in this county. But I rode toward you instead, and I have never once regretted it, not even during the hardest winters, not even when your temper has flared hot enough to make the hired hands scatter." "You are the only man who ever stayed," Julia murmured against his shoulder. "The only one who was never afraid of the fire in me. You just found ways to stand beside it instead." "Because I learned something a lot of men never bother to learn, Julia Turner Rourke," Hugh said. using her full married name with deliberate tenderness. "A fire like yours does not need taming. It just needs someone willing to stand close enough to feel its warmth instead of running from its heat." Julia fell asleep that night with her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat, safe and warm despite the howling wind outside, secure in the knowledge that whatever trials the years ahead might bring, she would face them with a partner who had proven himself, time and again, worthy of every bit of fire she had to give. The ranch continued to prosper through the following years, weathering droughts and market fluctuations and all the usual hardships that came with life on the Kansas plains. But always, at the center of it all, stood the steady partnership between Hugh Rourke and Julia Turner, a marriage built not on the absence of conflict, but on the presence of unwavering respect and devotion. Their youngest child, a boy named Thomas born in 1887, grew up hearing the story of how his parents met, told and retold at family gatherings until it had taken on the polished quality of legend, though the essential truth of it never changed. A drifter had ridden onto a ranch, warned that its owner had a temper fierce enough to drive off any sensible man, and instead of running, he had stayed, had matched her fire with his own steady patience, and had built alongside her a life richer and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined alone. By the time Samuel reached his 20th year in 1899, old enough to take on greater responsibility for the ranch's daily operations, Hugh and Julia had begun to slow their own pace just slightly, content to watch their children grow into the same fierce, loving partnership they themselves had built. Grace had married a young doctor from Ellsworth and settled nearby, close enough to visit every Sunday. Their second son, William, had taken to ranching with an ease that suggested he might one day run an outfit of his own, while young Thomas, still a boy of 12, spent most of his days trailing after his older siblings, soaking up every lesson about cattle and horses and the land that had shaped his family's entire history. On a warm evening in June of that year, more than 2 decades after Hugh Rourke had first ridden onto Turner land with nothing but a good horse and a warning ringing in his ears, he and Julia sat together on the same porch where they had shared their first real conversation, where he had first glimpsed the grief hiding beneath her fierce exterior, where they had exchanged their wedding vows beneath a cottonwood tree that still stood strong and tall in the yard below. "Do you remember," Julia said, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and gold, "what that old liveryman in Abilene told you about me?" "I remember," Hugh said, smiling at the familiar question, one she asked every few years as though testing whether the answer had changed. "He told me you had a temper that would strip bark off a cottonwood tree. And what did you tell him?" "I told him I had dealt with worse." Julia laughed, the same warm, surprised laugh he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "You had no idea what you were riding into." "No," Hugh agreed, taking her weathered hand in his, tracing the lines that decades of hard work and hard-won love had etched into her skin. "I had no idea at all. I thought I was riding toward a job." A little peace and quiet after too many years chasing outlaws across half of Texas. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with the same tenderness he had shown her on that rain-soaked afternoon so many years before. "Instead, I rode straight into the finest thing that ever happened to me. Nobody warned me about that part, Julia. Nobody warned me you would be worth every single bit of fire you carried, and then some." Julia's eyes filled with tears, the same way they had on so many occasions over the past 2 decades, and she leaned into her husband's embrace, watching their grandchildren, Grace's 2 young daughters, chase fireflies across the yard as the last light faded from the Kansas sky. "I love you, Hugh Rourke," she said softly. "I have loved you since that thunderstorm, since the moment you told me I did not need anyone's permission to keep what was mine, and you meant it, and you proved it, every single day for over 20 years. "I love you too, Julia Turner," Hugh murmured against her hair, using her maiden name one final time, the same tender private joke they had shared since their wedding day. More today than I did yesterday, and I suspect I will say the very same thing tomorrow, and every day after that, for as long as I am fortunate enough to draw breath beside you. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. Two people who had built a life far richer than either had dared to imagine, bound together by a love that had weathered every storm the wild Kansas plains had thrown at them. A love born from a warning about temper that had, in truth, been nothing more than the first sign of a fire fierce enough to burn bright for a lifetime, and warm enough to make a house, a ranch, and an entire family feel like home. And so it was that Julia Turner, once warned would drive away any man foolish enough to try to love her, and Hugh Rourke, once warned about a temper that would test any man's patience, found in each other not a challenge to be conquered or a fire to be tamed, but a partner worth every storm, every hardship, and every fierce, beautiful moment of a love that lasted a lifetime, spanning decades on the same Kansas land where it had first begun, growing stronger with each passing year, until it became, in the end, simply and completely home.